Children evacuate their kindergarten after artillery fire caves in the wall of a classroom. 2 staff members suffered concussion as shells struck the surrounding town and disrupted electricity supply.
What can I say? Do we have any say in all this? None whatsoever. I think it is a stupidity. You want to shoot? Shoot at each other.
Separatists accused Ukraine of being behind the civilian attacks, but Ukraine has pointed the finger at the Russian-backed group.
Russia will attempt to create various situations to put responsibility on Ukraine, but we are well prepared for any scenario.
That claim is supported by the US and the UK, both accusing Russia of trying to fabricate a pretext for invasion.
We have reason to believe that they are engaged in a false flag operation to have an excuse to go in.
We fear very much that that is the kind of thing we'll see more of over the next few days.
At the UN, Russia hit back against the accusations.
I would even go so far as to say that they are dangerous because they bring in more tension into the already tense atmosphere.
It remains a highly volatile situation, and an invasion of Ukraine is, of course, imminent.
If Russia does invade, the US, UK and Europe are promising to hit the country with massive sanctions.
We are ready with our allies to impose severe costs on Russia through an unprecedented package of coordinated sanctions.
But will this be enough to deter a nation and a leader who's shown no signs of backing down?
Well, Steven Pifer is America's former ambassador to Ukraine. Welcome to the program. Putin appears hell-bent on escalation. Will the threat of sanctions have any effect?
Well, I hope so. There are a number of things that may dissuade Putin and the Kremlin from launching a major attack on Ukraine. One is sanctions. Another is the prospect of having NATO increase its force presence on its eastern flank next to Russia. A third is that if the Russians do go in, you're likely to see a much greater flow of arms from the United States and European countries into Ukraine to help the Ukrainians defend themselves. But the main costs are going to be imposed by the Ukrainians. If the Russians come in, the Ukrainian military and perhaps the Ukrainian guerrilla war will extract a price on the Russians.
So what do you think would have to happen in order for Russia to back down?
Well, I think Russia needs to sit back and take a look at the real costs, and not just the cost that the West would impose, but again, a military campaign by the Russians into Ukraine. Certainly the Russian military can overmatch the Ukrainians in certain categories, such as air power. But I was in Kyiv 2 weeks ago. The Ukrainians are determined to resist. They will fight back. And I think that is the question that Putin has to ask himself. My guess is Putin doesn't care that much about dead soldiers per se, but what impact will that have on his domestic opinion when all of a sudden they start seeing their sons and their husbands and their brothers coming home in body bags? And that may be the factor that could deter the Kremlin in the end, and that I hope will deter them.
Stephen, the US and UK say that kindergarten shelling was a false flag operation, that Russian-backed forces did it, but are blaming Ukraine. Now the US Secretary of State has warned that Russia may stage an even bigger attack involving a drone strike or chemical weapons. Is that likely? And if that does happen, how quickly could things escalate?
Well, there certainly is an expectation, and the United States and the British have been talking about this now for a couple of weeks, is that the Russians would want some excuse, some pretext to launch a military offensive. So there is concern that they might stage something. But I think one of the reasons why American intelligence people are talking about this is precisely to discount that pretext before the Russians can put it into play. And I think it's probably taken the Kremlin a bit back.
Doesn't it say something, though, about the weakness of the United States globally, the weakness of the European Union, that Russia can do this, even if they don't actually wage a full-scale war here? Doesn't it show how weakened the West has become?
Well, my guess is that we have this crisis now because Vladimir Putin looked at the relative power balance and saw his power probably in a pretty strong position. You know, he's been modernizing his military for 10 years. He has a significant amount of money in his foreign reserves. And he looks at the West and he sees America, we have internal divisions here, a new government in Germany. The French are getting ready for their presidential elections, and Boris Johnson in the UK has his problems at home. And so he may have thought that the West would be divided. But my guess is the Kremlin has been fairly surprised by the unity of the Western response, both in terms of the United States and NATO, where you've had the United States, Britain, France, and Germany, and others sending troops to bolster the military presence on NATO's eastern flank to signal the Russians that while NATO's not going to go to war with Russia over Ukraine, NATO will defend NATO territory. And then also very close consultations now going back more than 2 months, so that the United States and the European Union have a pretty good set of sanctions, very painful sanctions, lined up that they would apply fairly quickly were the Russians to cross the line into Ukraine again.
Stephen, Ukraine's president is a former comedian, and as a comedian who's always dreamed of running my own country, how would you rate the president's performance?
I think Mr. Zelensky has some flaws, but I actually give him credit. I think he's held fairly steady through this crisis, and that probably has also surprised the Russians. My guess is in the Kremlin, one of their hopes was that just this massing of military power would cause Ukraine to get wobbly, would cause the government to make some concessions. But President Zelensky and his government had held fairly steady.
So does that mean you would formally endorse on television comedians running more countries, maybe countries like Australia?
I'm not sure I want to interfere in Australians' domestic politics.
That's a yes. It wasn't anything close to a yes, but I'm taking it as a yes.
Hot tip before you embark on this career. We don't have a president, but, you know.
OK. Well, First Republic, second, we put Akmal in charge.
Stephen, thank you so much for your time tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.